I call Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the second reading of the Substance Addiction Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Bill. I didn't follow this bill through the Select Committee process. It was my former colleague, Kevin Haig, who was on the committee to hear the submissions. I do know that Mr. Haig did think this was a very good piece of legislation, and having looked at it myself, the Green Party will be continuing to support the bill. My understanding is that they did have a very constructive process during the submissions, and as my former colleague said in his first reading speech, it's been at least the last 30 years that the alcohol and other drug treatment sector have been calling for an update to the Alcoholism and Drug Addiction Act, which was, of course, from 1966, which is 50 years ago. So, well overdue, this change. And I, of course, would like to very much tautoko what the minister was saying in terms of taking a more wraparound approach to treating problems of addiction. And I think that fundamentally this bill takes at its heart a framework which represents a paradigm shift about how we deal with addiction. And the previous act, which is being superseded by this bill, or will be, hopefully, very much treated it almost in a punitive way. And I think that throughout New Zealand we have, and not just in New Zealand, in other countries, in the 20th century, we did have a tendency to treat drug issues with a criminal approach, as a criminal problem, rather than treating it as a health problem. And what this bill recognizes, and what I think we would all do well to recognize, is that addiction is a health issue, and we must treat it as such if we want to get better outcomes. And this bill not only updates the guidelines on compulsory drug and addiction treatment, it also provides for reducing the time of detention. It has specific provisions around young people, acknowledging the role that family and support people play, provides for long-term community care for people who have a brain injury from addiction. And I think that all of that is just as important. It's not just about the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and what we do when people are in the very worst state. They might actually be at risk of dying from their addiction, in which case this bill sets up the guidelines for which they might be compulsorily put in care to help deal with that addiction. It also recognizes that it's not just a personal individual problem, that addiction takes place in a social environment, and that if we don't address some of the surrounding factors around addiction, then we will not be able to treat it. And this reflects a wider paradigm shift about addiction, which is quite interesting, that it's very much a social and environmental problem as much as something that individuals are susceptible to from particular substances. There are a whole lot of very interesting studies coming out that suggest that people in poor conditions, if they don't have good living conditions, if they're under severe stress financially, if they don't have solid social relationships, they're far more susceptible to becoming addicted to a substance that may not actually result in addiction if people are living in a good context and have the basics. And we see this the way in dealing with homelessness. They're very much, it used to be the case that people would not treat homeless people, provide them with homes. They'd say you have to deal with all their addictions and problems first if the people were indeed suffering from drug and alcohol addiction. But in fact, the housing first approach has demonstrated that we cannot even begin to deal with some of the other health problems that people are facing, like addiction, unless they have a warm, dry, secure place to call home. And so when we understand that addiction is something that happens in a social context, it happens that we come up with far more effective ways of dealing with it. And the Green Party is very supportive and has long been an advocate of treating drug issues as a health issue, and so in order to get far more effective results rather than treating it as a criminal issue. And so we are pleased with this bill and the provisions that it's made, and particularly the reference to the support of family and community. And there's only a very tiny number of people who will qualify for compulsory committal. There's an incredibly high threshold, and this bill actually introduced greater safeguards than what was in the previous act. So the Green Party can support the bill at the second reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Barbara.